Hey guys, it's Miss Lovell here. Today we're going to be talking about comparing and contrasting stories. Now, whenever we're comparing and contrasting stories, remember, we're focusing on a fictional text. In today's lesson, we're going to be reading these two stories. But before we can compare and contrast them, there's some important information that you need to know. Before we can get started, you might be asking yourself, how do I compare and contrast stories? Normally, whenever we compare and contrast stories, we use a Venn diagram, such as the one on my page. A Venn diagram is two circles that overlap. In the first circle, you talk about story one. So the first story that you're working on, you'll talk about all the things that make that story different. In the second circle, you'll compare and contrast story number two. On this side of the circle, you'll write all the ways that the second story is different from the first story. And then wherever the circles overlap, that's how you talk about how the two stories are similar or the same. In today's lesson, we will be using a Venn diagram to compare and contrast two different versions of the story Little Red Riding Hood. Before we jump into that, there are a few important terms that I would like to discuss so you can have a better understanding of these words while we compare and contrast the stories. The first term that I want us to better understand is the word compare. Whenever you're comparing something, you are pointing out the things that are similar. So today, whenever we're comparing our two stories, we're saying how they are the same or similar. The second word that I want us to understand is the word contrast. Whenever you are contrasting something, you are pointing out the things that are different. Same thing, when we're reading our stories today, we need to see how they're not only the same, but how they also differ. Next is the word character. A character is a person or an animal that's in the story. The next term is setting. A setting is where the action takes place, where the story is told. Next, we have the word plot. A plot is a set of events in the story. What happens in the story? What takes place? And lastly, we have theme. The theme of a story is the message or the lesson that you learn from the story. So today, while we're reading our two stories, I want you to think about all of these important terms and how we can use them to better compare and contrast the two texts. In today's lesson, we are going to be comparing and contrasting these two stories. The first story that we will be reading is titled Red Riding Hood. This is the original version of Red Riding Hood. The second story that we will be reading is titled Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. This is a spin-off of the original version. Now, if you're in a classroom setting while watching this video and you have access to both of these books, please feel free to read them to your class before continuing this video. If not, I have recorded myself reading both Red Riding Hood and Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion in two separate videos. If you do not have access to these books, please feel free to watch those videos before you continue. Once you've read both the stories, please hit play on this video so we can continue our lesson. Now that we've read both Red Riding Hood and Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion, let's compare and contrast our stories. To compare and contrast our stories, we're going to be using two different charts. This first chart is one that's very similar in your Ready workbook. In the first column, we will be comparing and contrasting the events from Red Riding Hood, and in the second column, we will be comparing and contrasting the events from Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. The first thing that we need to compare and contrast are the characters. So, thinking back to the story Red Riding Hood, who are the characters in that story? You're right, we had Red Riding Hood, the wolf, and Granny. So now I'm going to write that in my first box. Remember, whenever you're writing in a chart, it doesn't need to be in complete sentences because we're just brainstorming and getting our ideas out there. So for this box, I'm going to write Red Riding Hood, the wolf, and Granny. Great job! Now let's think about the characters that we saw in Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. In this story, we have Little Red, the lion, and her Auntie Rosie. Great job. Now let's talk about the setting. Both stories took place in different places. In Red Riding Hood, where was the scary place that she had to travel through to get to her granny's house? You're right, she had to travel through the woods. So that's what I'm going to put in my setting under Red Riding Hood. I'm going to write down the woods. Awesome job. Now, the setting of Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion was different. It didn't happen in the woods, but it happened where there was elephants, gazelles, meerkats. So that's kind of like a jungle. So for the setting for my second story, I'm going to write jungle. Okay, now we're moving on to the plot of these two different stories. Remember, the plot is a set of events that happen in the story. So what happened in Red Riding Hood that's important? You're right, the wolf tricks Little Red and ends up eating her and her granny. So I want to write that response in my blank. The wolf tricks Red Riding Hood and eats her and Granny. Now, how is the plot different for Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion? Does the lion end up eating Little Red and Auntie Rosie? No, he doesn't. So for this plot, we're going to say that the lion tries to trick Little Red and eat her. The lion tries to trick Little Red and attempts to eat her. The reason why I put attempts and tries is because he was not successful. In that story, he did not eat her and he also did not trick her. Lastly, we need to think about the theme in these two different stories. Remember, the theme is the message or the lesson that we learned from the story. In this story, Red Riding Hood believes that the wolf is actually her granny. Through this, I realized that people are not always what they seem. So I'm going to write that down for my theme of my first story. People are not always what they seem. Fantastic. Now let's think about the theme that we learned from Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. So through this story, the lion really learns a lesson that connects to what we can learn. And that is that trying to trick someone is never the answer. In the story, the lion tries to trick Little Red into believing that he is Auntie Rosie. In the end, this does not work out in his favor, and he learns a really important lesson from Little Red that if he was just hungry, all he had to do was ask. So, from this, I've learned that trying to trick someone is never going to have a good outcome. I'm going to type my response in the blank. Trying to trick someone is never the answer. Guys, y'all did such a great job helping me fill out this important information in this chart. Let's move on to our second chart. Okay, guys, our second chart is a Venn diagram. Remember, in a Venn diagram, we're comparing and contrasting by writing the ways that the stories are different in each side of the circle and writing how they're the same in the middle. So the way that I like to do my Venn diagrams is I focus on one story and how it's different, and then I move on to the next, and then lastly, I talk about how they're similar. So the first story we're going to talk about is Red Riding Hood. In this chart, we're going to be comparing and contrasting the different events in the story. The first thing that was different in Red Riding Hood than in our second story was the act of what Red was doing. She was going to visit her granny. So I'm going to type that first. I'm going to say she was going to visit Granny. Another difference that I saw in this story was who Red meets while traveling to her granny's house. When she was going through the woods, she came along a wolf. So I'm going to write that as my second difference. Red meets a wolf. Another difference that I saw in the first story that I did not see in the second story is that the wolf actually escorts Red to her granny's house, for some of the way at least. I'm going to write that as my third difference. The wolf escorts Red to her granny's house. From there, the wolf sneaks off and goes to the granny's house. Another difference in our first story than our second story is that the wolf actually eats her granny. So I'm going to write that as my fourth difference. The wolf eats Granny. In addition to this difference, the wolf actually tricks Red Riding Hood into thinking that he is her granny. That didn't happen in the second story, so that's another great difference that I can write in my Venn diagram. The wolf tricks Red. In our first story, the wolf actually eats Red Riding Hood as well. That didn't happen in our second story, so I want to make sure I include that in one of my differences. The wolf eats Red. And the last difference that I can see from the two stories is that at the end of the story, another character is introduced, which is the hunter, and the hunter kills the wolf and saves Red and her granny. So I'm going to write that down as my last difference. A hunter kills the wolf and saves Red and her granny. Awesome job, guys. Now that we've talked about all the differences that we saw in the first story, let's write all the differences we saw in Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. The first difference is that Little Red was not going to see her granny. She was actually going to visit her Auntie Rosie. So I'm going to write that as my first difference. Going to visit Auntie Rosie. The second difference is that Little Red doesn't run across a wolf, but instead she comes across a lion. So I'm going to put that in as my second difference. Little Red meets a lion. Another way that these stories differ is that the lion doesn't walk with Little Red to her auntie's house. He actually rushes ahead so he can get there first. So I'm going to include that as my third difference. The lion rushes to Auntie Rosie's house. Now, whenever the lion gets to Auntie Rosie's house, does he eat her? No, that's another way that this story is different. He actually stuffs Auntie Rosie into a cabinet. So I'm going to make sure I include that on this side of the Venn diagram. The lion puts Auntie Rosie into a cabinet. Now, whenever Little Red arrives, was she fooled by the lion's disguise like Red Riding Hood was in our first story? No, she knows right away that that is not her Auntie Rosie. So that's another difference in our second story. So I'm going to make sure I add that to my chart. Little Red is not fooled by the lion. As a result of Little Red knowing that it's the lion disguised as Aunt Rosie, what does she do? Is she asking him lots of questions? No, she decides to teach him a lesson, and she ends up messing with him, right? By doing all of those ridiculous things. So I'm going to include that on my chart as well. Little Red messes with the lion. The last difference I want to write in my chart is that at the very end of the story, the lion isn't killed by a hunter, but instead, he promises to never eat another person again, like an auntie or a little kid or even her daddy. So I'm going to write that as my last difference. The lion promises not to eat another person. Awesome job, guys. We were able to spot out all of the differences that we saw in Red Riding Hood and Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion. Now, our work is not finished. Now we have to talk about how the two stories are similar. In both stories, the two young girls are both visiting someone who is sick. In Red Riding Hood, her granny has the snuffs, and in Little Red and the Very Hungry Lion, her auntie is covered in spots. So we can say that they both are going to visit someone sick. What's another similarity that the two stories have in common? You're right, both girls meet an animal along the way. I'm going to put that as my second similarity. Both girls meet an animal along the way. Now let's try to think of one more thing that was similar in both stories. Can you think of anything? You're right, both animals try to disguise themselves as the person that the girls are going to visit. So for my third and last similarity, I'm going to write both animals dress up as a person. Wow, y'all did a fantastic job at filling out not only this chart, but the other chart as well. I've had so much fun comparing and contrasting these two stories with you today. I've had so much fun learning with y'all today. I'll see you next time.